Hey, all you early bats, we'll start in just a couple minutes. Enjoy Pleated Gazelle into Whitby. Welcome, Dracuphiles. Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own will. I am Edward G. Pettit, the host of Sundays with Dracula from the Rosenbach in Philadelphia, which is the home of Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula. Over 100 pages of outlines, early plot ideas, and research notes compiled by the author over the 7 years he developed and wrote the book. It is an extraordinary record of the conception and development of a novel. And joining me today for this very special program is Mark Gatiss, the co-creator of the new BBC Dracula. Mark has also presented the TV documentary In Search of Dracula, in which for one segment he visited the Rosenbach to study Stoker's notes. He also played Dracula in the full cast audio drama for Big Finish. I could go on and on about all the great things he's done, especially in horror. But I am overjoyed to welcome today's Prince of Darkness, Mark Gatiss.
Hello, how are you? Look at my background.
That is fabulous. Is that the? Oh, that's the Hammer. That's the Hammer Castle.
I've also accidentally dressed as Father Shandor. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Thanks for coming. Are you drinking anything special today? To any particular vintage?
No, I've stayed off it until we've finished.
Oh, okay.
Then I'm going to get hammered.
Not to make a pun with your background, but I can't wait. So I'm having this is a mint julep that's for the sugar syrup. It's made with grenadine syrup, so it's red. I call it a bloody julep. So
very nice.
That's my drink for today that I will be enjoying while we do this. And everyone, we're going to talk about all things Dracula today. If you have questions for Mark, use the Q&A box on the Zoom interface. I'm pointing at it like you can see my computer, right? On your Zoom interface, there's a Q&A box. Use that for questions. And I'll start to take some of your questions probably around the second half of the show after Mark and I chat for a little bit. And you can use the chat to talk among yourselves, and that it's usually really rich on Sundays with Dracula. I'm sure it will be today. And we have Andrew from the Rosenbach is our chat Renfield today, so he'll be putting up links in the chat for you guys as we talk about them. So, Mark, to start off, we have a companion show on Sundays with Dracula. It's called Monday Drac Chat, and I welcome a Dracuphile from our audience. And the first question I always ask them is, what is your Dracula story? about like how they first came to read or become obsessed with Dracula. So let's start with that then. What's your Dracula story?
Gosh. Well, it's definitely, it's the Brides of Dracula. It's the first horror film I ever saw, and obviously the first Dracula film, although Dracula isn't in it. I was 4 years old, so I remember it distinctly, particularly the windmill ending. And I was just instantly hooked. And it's very hard to tell then, isn't it? Because I was so into horror films from such an early age, and I had so many different influences, different books and things like that. But I suppose then it was probably seeing clips of Lugosi, definitely clips of Nosferatu. There was a show over here called Clapperboard, which was a film program for kids. And in the opening titles, they had bits from Nosferatu, a bit on the stairs.
Because that's not scary at all for kids, right?
No, I know. It was the 70s. You could do anything then. And so it's hard to say. Definitely Brides of Dracula first, and then the one that was always on was Dracula, Prince of Darkness. That was the most frequently shown of the Hammers. I remember seeing the Lugosi one. I mean, it's quite early. I suppose when I was about 10 or 11 or something like that, probably on the BBC double bill. But it was just it was a confluence of things. But I didn't read it until I was on holiday in Whitby. And I thought, well, this is the time I'm going to actually have to get around to reading it. And I wish I could remember I stayed in a little hotel. I'd like to believe it was the room where Bram Stoker stayed, but it was a seafront thing with a sort of bay window. I remember that. But I just remember being really knocked out by how incredibly gripping the first third was, the opening chapters in Castle Dracula, and thinking, God, this must have caused, an explosion in Victorian literature, which, as we know, indeed it did.
And especially to read it in Whitby, and those scenes
in
Whitby. Did you do the steps to the graveyard? Did you do that?
Well, I knew, because I'm from the north, and Whitby was somewhere we went quite often. It was my favourite place to go. I also collected fossils. It was full of joy for me. And I certainly knew about the Dracula connection. It just made the place even better. That was before it became Goth Central, of course.
Yeah. Did you have a cape as a child?
I had a curtain. We had an ottoman in the back bedroom, and we had a red curtain. I can't remember. The funny thing is, I can't remember the red curtains being up. They were velvety. But they were packed away in this ottoman, and I used to wear it specifically to reenact Christopher Lee's death throes from Risen from the Grave, which used to be my favourite, which I think it's the sort of Hammer that appeals to you most when you're about 8 or 9. Because of course,
is he staked in the pit in that one? Yeah.
Yeah, it's the goriest. He's staked twice, gets away with it, and then of course is impaled in a giant gold cross. I mean, what more? With his eyes bleeding. It's ghastly.
What do you think, because you really enjoyed lots of horror and different kinds of monsters, do you think there was anything, even as a child, like I understand why I think adults sometimes, I think the sexuality of Dracula and vampires really appeal, but as a child, what was there special about Dracula, do you think, that made him stand out from monsters?
I think, well, I really like vampires. I think over and above, I suppose even as a kid, there is something sexy about it, even if you don't know what's going on. That's what it is. I remember the sort of the power of, for instance, Prince of Darkness, which is the one, as I say, I saw the most as a kid. That moment when he comes down into the cellar and menaces Barbara Shelley. I knew there was something going on,
Mm-hmm.
And also when she turns from this prim Victorian spinster into, well, not she's married actually, this prim Victorian woman into this sort of wanton sexual creature. I mean, it's still just an amazing performance, isn't it? But
yeah,
I just remember, and of course, and Christopher Lee had this amazing kind of power. There was something going on that made your heart pound, and that amazing moment where he cuts open his chest with his fingernail, and
mm-hmm.
there's a lot of rich stuff going on there. So I'm sure it was to do with that. There was something it's something we all respond to, which you don't respond to the Mummy in the same way.
Although my favorite Universal is the Karloff Mummy. It really is.
It? Yes.
It's so
Beautiful.
Beautiful. Karloff is so powerful. That sedate, very still performance is so gripping. So I really like that.
It's a beautiful film, but I would myself would use it to get to sleep. Sleep for 1,000 years.
Is Christopher Lee, did he become like your Dracula then? Often when people encounter these characters the first time, that's theirs. The same thing with Hamlet. Yeah. Like you have a Hamlet, and this is
completely yes. I mean, I remember finding the Lugosi film a disappointment, and as I said in the documentary, you can totally understand what those kind of dark, brooding Hungarian looks did to the audience. But from this distance, and even as a child, it seemed, and also because I suppose it was already the sort of mimicked version, wasn't it? The white waistcoat and the lounge wear that seemed so sort of hammy, I suppose. Mm-hmm. Whereas Christopher Lee had this amazing presence, as I say, and he felt, in a way, I suppose he was still the current Dracula when I was growing up. Mm-hmm. But I remember very well, I had a friend who grown up in the 50s, and he told me what it was like going to see the 58 Dracula. And they were all teenagers, and it was middle of summer, and they all went along expecting this to be very sort of hammy, and they were just totally blown away by this 38-year-old man, very handsome, and all those things you read about, really, that he sort of reignited the whole idea of the demon lover, I suppose. So yes, he's very much mine. But I was 11 when the great Philip Saville version was on the BBC with Louis Jourdan, and I just adored that. I still adore that. It's one of my absolute favorites.
Yeah, you mentioned that to me at the Rosenbach that you love that so much.
It's Louis so good. I mean, it's an object lesson, because it really is the most faithful version, but it doesn't it doesn't feel kind of careful and over reverential. Gerald Savory nicks bits from other Draculas, because he knows it's cool and he knows it's good to do, but it's properly atmospheric. I think it has everything, the music onwards, it has a queasy quality. It's a strange brew. It actually makes you feel slightly like you've been bitten in the night and you didn't know what was going on. And Louis Jourdan is just so immaculately cast. As I said, a very beautiful man whose looks are just slightly sliding, which gives it a kind of it has somehow a sort of quality of the grave about it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's something that in a Dorian Gray way should be permanent, and actually is just sort of sliding into decrepitude.
It's so enjoyable to watch that one and his performance in it. I want to remind everybody in the chat that there is a feature on Zoom chat that the default is to all panelists, and if you're sending chat messages to that, other people aren't seeing them. So put all panelists and attendees. And then everyone can see your chat in the chat. And we are getting some questions in here. And at the risk of getting off track here, there's one here from Jennifer, and she says, which was more scary as a kid, vampires or Daleks?
Oh, vampires in a way, because I suppose, I didn't think the Daleks were going to come and get me. Actually, I was always more frightened of the Cybermen. Anyway, I love the Daleks. I didn't find them that frightening, but vampires, that seemed like a clear and present danger. Although, if we're going to go slightly off topic, the thing that really did for me was The Devil Rides Out, because that felt in a sort of the way that Rosemary's Baby does. You just think there's something deeply wrong about this, Mm-hmm. And I remember going to bed after seeing The Devil Rides Out and not daring to let my foot stick out from under the blanket, in case someone got it, the devil got it. And actually trying to reason with myself, I thought, this time yesterday, I was perfectly all right. What's changed? And it was the goat of Mendes. That's what had changed.
Is that Is that Christopher Lee's only horror film where he's the good guy?
I'm sure it's not, but it's a rare one.
Yeah, it really is. I can't think of any. Well, I'm
He's
trying
in
to
a
think of
few
one on
others,
top of
but
my
he
head.
gets sort of knocked off, doesn't he? But yes, he's definitely the hero.
Yeah.
It's such a gorgeous film. I wish there'd been more Dennis Wheatleys in that vein.
Mm-hmm. You eventually did get to play Dracula for the Big Finish audio drama. Was it 2016, I think, or 2017? I can't remember when it came out. What was it like finally at that point getting to play Dracula yourself in a very strong, faithful adaptation of the novel?
Well, it was lovely. I mean, it was one of those, I think they knew when they sent the email that I couldn't say no. I suppose I had been waiting all my life to play it, but it was lovely. It's a really, really good adaptation, very faithful, but again, not sort of deathlessly so. And I mean, the strange thing is you become aware, as every Dracula must do, is if you do the novel, you're not in it very much. So you actually have to make your appearances count.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember I was very lucky in that. I think the day before we started recording, I'd been to a party or something, and I'd basically been talking above music all night. And I woke up the next morning and my voice was so gravelly. I thought, oh, brilliant. It's perfect for Dracula. So thank goodness for that party, But you have to make these things count. And it was really, you find yourself in that position if you're ever lucky enough to go, right, well, how am I going to say, listen to the Children of the Night or any of it, Welcome to My House? You just think, well, it's my go.
Yeah.
I might try and do something different with this. But, it was a lovely experience.
How did you approach the voice in that too? But you do a very slow. You're not hurried at all, are you? In that?
Well, I remember years ago, I've forgotten who it was, but an actor said to me, the thing is, powerful people do not have to shout. And of course, that's true. That's one of the. That's when you can tell someone who has genuine power. They're very comfortable in their own skin and very confident. And obviously, if someone's been alive for 400 years and they've seen everything, they're actually pretty relaxed. I would say Dracula's a very relaxed man because he's seen it all, hasn't he? And nothing's going to get under his skin, and so it's like that really. And I did do a bit of research and trying to get a little trace of the accent without it becoming too Bela Lugosi, because that's a bit of a trap, isn't it?
Yeah.
But very much. It was more his attitude was very sort of relaxed, and also, of course, initially at least, he's very welcoming. I mean, we've talked about this. It's one of the great. There are great unseen scenes in Dracula, and one of them is Dracula making Harker's bed, making his dinner, making a lot of his food, and there's no clove there, there's no servant, so but he does it. You have to ask why. And I remember when I've just done the talking book for Penguin, and obviously I reread it before we did our adaptation, but also I read it again, reading it out. And the bit that really struck me was why Dracula has to bother. And also there's that amazing bit, which I'd totally forgotten about, where he puts Harker's suit on and climbs down the wall and then walks about in the village to sort of establish an alibi. That's quite strange, isn't it? That's quite a strange moment. Especially if I imagine also that he's, Harker's suit is really small on him and he's got like his arms and his legs are sticking out like that.
Somebody mentioned in our chat, I think it was Elizabeth, that actually in The Wicker Man, Christopher Lee's the good guy, but I guess that's just how you watch the movie.
That depends on your point of view.
Yeah.
I'm sure Sergeant Neil Howie didn't think that.
Yeah. So that's what. So and there's a couple sequels to that Dracula production now that Big Finish just released.
Yes.
That are available now, and they're tremendously good. There's a prequel and a sequel that they just released.
Yes,
so.
what it says in the First World War. It was,
So you're getting to do like what Christopher Lee did. You get to keep coming back and keep.
Well, yeah, it's lovely. That reminds me, because the other thing as a child that I had were the New English Library paperbacks, which were, Hands of Dracula, and there were loads of them with a very frightening Dracula. He was sort of a bit more like Robert Quarry, but really sort of pig-like face and actually very scary. But there were a number of sequels, so it's really nice to continue the tradition of Dracula rising again.
Which you have done in a very big way with the BBC. Thank you for the segue. With the new BBC Dracula that came out earlier this year. How did that first come about? That you got to finally, and with Stephen Moffat too, which is brilliant, to do an adaptation of Dracula.
Well, the most extraordinary thing, because of this extraordinary year, that it already feels like it was about 10 years ago. I can't believe it was only on this year.
It wasn't this year. Oh, no, it was actually this year. I'm thinking it was, yeah.
We know how Dracula feels. Well, it started as a joke in the best possible way. We were filming the third series of Sherlock, and we were literally 2 days in, and Steve and Sue Virtue and I had to come back to London for the Royal Television Society Awards, which we were up for Sherlock. And the scene we just shot was Sherlock coming back and surprising Mrs. Hudson. And Benedict was silhouetted against the door with his collar up. And I showed it to the then head of drama at the BBC. I said, "It looks like Dracula, doesn't it?" And he said, "Do you want to do it?" And Steve and I looked at each other and went, "Yes, obviously." But that was, and then that was the sort of germ of it. And that was what, 2013 or something like that. And so it wasn't an immediate process. But when we did the fourth series of Sherlock, and it certainly looked like we weren't going to do any more for a while, it seemed like the natural thing to pursue. So the new head of BBC Drama was also keen on the idea, so that's how it came about. And then we had as is traditional, we had a lunch to talk about what we might do. And again, as with Sherlock Holmes, you think about what the imperishable elements of it are, why Dracula has survived, why he hasn't been supplanted by other pretenders to the vampire throne, and what it was about that book which was so powerful and successful, and what are the less interesting bits or the more disposable bits. Or again, I mean, one of the things I loved discovering in the documentary was from David Scarl was the idea that the famous collar, which persists, it's even in the emoji, the Dracula emoji, is literally just to provide a way of Dracula disappearing through a trapdoor in the stage version, and yet somehow or other, like Sherlock Holmes, like a lot of famous characters, like Robin Hood, a lot of the things that we say are them have actually been put together by group decision, by the public over many, many years. Dracula now is a sort of composite of Stoker's Dracula and Christopher Lee's Dracula and Lugosi's Dracula and Max Schreck's Dracula, and it's really interesting that some of these things are inarguable. I think you just go, well, that you have to do that bit, otherwise it won't count.
Yeah,
I count again. I can't stop it.
You mentioned David Scala. I was hoping he was going to be here today. He actually emailed me last night that he might be in, but he's not in the chat yet. But Les Klinger is, who did the annotated Dragon from a few years ago. And Les had a question. I love this, and I have to ask you now. So Les says, so now that you've transported Deed to the 21st century, will you do a Dracula Sherlock crossover?
We've literally finally put to bed the idea of a Sherlock Doctor Who crossover. So there's no chance of a Dracula Sherlock crossover. David Stuart Davis did that, didn't he? Yes, the Tangled Skein. That's very good.
Yeah. There's several really good Sherlock Dracula crossovers. But so So you came up with the idea, and you know, and you got to pursue it, which is fabulous. But how did you? Let's talk about casting. How did you, when you put this together? You know, and of course, I want to get to Claes Bang because I think he's a tremendous Dracula. But what was that process like in the very beginning?
Well, it was interesting. We had a list of requirements. Obviously, again, a bit like Sherlock Holmes, there are certain things. For me, I don't think Dracula can be short. Dracula can't be chubby, even though, of course, vampires traditionally actually can be, because they're replete, aren't they? They're fat like slugs. Something that the idea of that used to horrify me as a child. But I wanted them to be svelte and gaunt and gothic, and there was the idea of them being like fat slugs. So it was, what we really wanted was someone middle-aged, tall, dark, and handsome, and not British. And that's an interesting quandary, because and also hopefully not famous, because you're not that famous, because you bring something different. You bring baggage. If Benedict Cumberbatch had been Dracula, he would be first and foremost known as Sherlock Holmes or Doctor Strange, and it's difficult. Whereas if you as it were, if you create a star, create an actor's first part, in terms of the general public or the worldwide perception, then you've sort of got it. That's what they become. So anyway, we put these requirements to Kate Rhodes James, our casting director, incidentally the great niece of M.R. James. Isn't that nice? And
I'm sorry, who is?
Kate Rhodes James. She's the casting director.
Really? She's the great niece of M.R. James. That's wonderful.
Nice.
Yeah.
Uncle Monty, as they call him in the family. and we had a list, and there was a guy on it called Claes Bang, which obviously is a very arresting name, and she'd ringed it, and she put, I think this guy's very interesting. And then we watched The Square, the film which had just come out to great international acclaim, and I remember just go, well look, there's Dracula. Dracula walks in. It says in the script of The Square, enter Dracula. I mean, he looks amazing. He's 6'5", same height as Christopher Lee. He looks like 3 James Bonds all at the same time, and he is very distinctly not British. He has a different quality to him. So he couldn't come over because his visa had expired. This is all pre-lockdown, and it's 2 years ago now. So I was doing a play. I was playing George III in Nottingham, and I couldn't go. Stephen Sue went over to Copenhagen, and he basically read there. And then they sent me the video, and we all conferred when we got back. But it was pretty straightforward. There's no one else really in the frame.
That's interesting. You wrote that you also mentioned that he didn't look British, that you wanted to make sure that he looks East European or foreign.
Well, do you know the thing? It's a bit other. Yes, it's the way that I mean, Christopher Lee, of course, was British but of Italian descent. So he has a very different look, doesn't he? And obviously Louis Jourdan, I think, is it was his big influence on us. But yeah, he really is very French. But what he is definitely not is English.
Mm-hmm.
and so the dark eyes and the bone structure, it's just you feel like he's definitely coming from the right place.
And there's something about Bang too that you discovered, the name Bang, that you discovered in David Scoll's bio, right?
Yes, in David's wonderful book, Something in the Blood. I sat up in my chair. Florence Stoker, when she was trying to have all the Prince of Nosferatu destroyed, and very nearly succeeded, as we know, she employed a lawyer, a Danish lawyer called C.S. Bang. No Christian name, but I'd like to think it was Claes. And I showed this, I was reading this, and I showed it to Claes on set the next day. He couldn't believe it. And I said, your great-grandfather or your grandfather. Your great grandfather wasn't a lawyer, was he? And he said, no, he was a welder or a docker or something like that. But who knows? It's possible there might be a family link.
That's fabulous. So that he was
strange, isn't it?
Yeah. The somebody has a real good question here that I like a lot. That Joanna says that you had mentioned in one of the TV show publicity that no one had done the ship voyage before, and she writes, "What inspired you when creating the other characters aboard the boat and their motivations?" I love that about you, and it's the whole middle episode is the Demeter. That is just fabulous.
Well, I remember when I read it as a teenager that the sort of 8 or so pages of the captain's log of the Demeter, I just remember thinking, this is brilliant stuff. And actually, I have to say, I wish Stoker had done a bit more with it. And obviously, it does feature in some other adaptations, but it's usually glossed over, or it's hard. But I mean, it was essentially a chance to do, as it were, 10 Little Indians meets Death on the Nile meets Dracula, which is kind of my sweet spot, really, and irresistible. But then we had this, and originally, in a funny kind of way, the first draft, we struggled with the same thing of like what to do with him. And that was because he was still sort of hiding like he is in the novel. He would pop up at night and knock one of the passengers off, and he wasn't in it enough. And then we had the idea, it's like, well, if this is like an Agatha Christie, what if he's the detective, essentially? What if he's hiding absolutely in plain sight, playfully so, he's actually, as it were, almost powering the investigation whilst he is the murderer.
Yeah.
Actually, even Christie did that. So it was just great fun then to do it. But the most extraordinary thing about the episode was we looked at real ships, and as is usual with these things, of course, they're actually tiny. I mean, if Dracula were on board a real ship, you would find him immediately. He would just be over there at the corner because there's no room. And we realized we were going to have to build the ship, and that was an extraordinary endeavor. And it was one of the most beautiful things. Actually, one of those tragic things where you feel, can we please do something with this set? It seems so wrong to have to destroy it as we did at the end, because it took up the whole of one of the sound stages at Brave Studios.
Wow.
Absolutely diagonally, corner to corner, the whole, absolutely vast. And it was so much fun to play with. It was like being on a pirate ship.
I'm just noticing the chat. One of the people in the chat is Tucker Christine, and Tucker's one of my co-hosts on Sundays with Dracula. He also is the composer and the musician for our intro music that I was playing in today. The Pleated Gazelle is Tucker's musical outfit, but he has he wrote that so many great Easter eggs in that, especially in that middle episode. How conscious were you? Well, yes, you were very conscious of putting all these nods to previous Draculas and all kinds of things. And how was that process in doing that? Did people say, like, stop it at any point?
Well, no one else knew what we were doing. That's the great benefit. I mean, maybe they would have done it for you.
It's only real Dracula files that notice them, right?
Yeah. But Arwell Wynne-Jones, the brilliant designer, he put a few in as well, which it wasn't until I was watching the edit of episode 3 that I realized that the hospital room was called AD 72. Beautiful. I cheered when I saw that. I didn't even know that was there. No, but I mean, I think these are, in a funny way, because it all begins with childhood enthusiasm. It's a wonderful way of just tipping your hat to things, and obviously not as long as it doesn't pull the audience out of it, because most people don't know. But there's nothing wrong with that. For instance, in Sherlock, I got Douglas Wilmer into the second series of Sherlock as an elderly gentleman in the Diogenes Club, and it was that was just a marvelous thing. I mean, he was way before my time, but I knew he was one of the great TV Sherlocks, and it was just a nice thing to do, And I love doing that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. So I was somebody trying to get in, and I was trying to resolve that problem.
Keep them out. Keep them out.
Did you? Was there? Are there any stories about that filming itself that you remember that were extraordinary, or something that was really special about the making of that something that really hit you?
Well, I mean, the big thing really was, as you know, we shot it at Bray Studios, which was an incredible coincidence. I filmed Miss Marple there 15 years ago, and it was about to close. And obviously as a Hammer fan, I found that so sad. But it never did, or it was going to be demolished, and then they couldn't find a buyer, and basically it was just left to rot. And then a couple of years ago, it was bought by somebody else, and then there was a huge drought in studio facilities, and it was opened up again. And by some amazing coincidence, we very nearly shot at Wembley Studios, but they couldn't do all the dates. And then suddenly Bray arrived, and Stephen said, he said to Sue, "Don't tell Mark until it's confirmed." and then it was just this amazing surprise. So to be doing Dracula again at Bray, and several bits on the original soundstage. I think Studio 3 is still the absolute original. Mm-hmm. That was extraordinary, because you could actually go through and think, this is what was shot here. We also shot a little bit at Oakley Court, which is the house next door, which was used as all Gothic exteriors. That's Castle Minster in Brides of Dracula and stuff like that. So It was amazing, and that's where I took the brides to tea. On the campus day.
Yeah, and the Search of Dracula. Someone asked me this in the question, so I'll ask you, but I don't think you'll know, is when In Search of Dracula will be available in the American market to watch.
Oh, I don't know. I'd love to find out. There's a strange, sometimes a strange path for these things. I find that there was definitely there was an issue about clip clearance outside of the UK. Was suddenly very, very much more expensive.
Okay, yeah.
But then sometimes they just appear. I did my history of horror and then Horror Europa, and people are always asking me when they're going to come out on DVD or whatever, and it's always the clips. They just cost the earth. And then sometimes, I don't know, Mark Cousins did that amazing series about the history of cinema, and that must have been a rights nightmare. But it can be done, I suppose, if you've got the distribution behind you. But I hope so. It would be nice. Although it's probably on YouTube, isn't it?
It is. You can find it. It's out there. But I'm not supposed to encourage that. I don't think.
I just want to get these things seen,
Yeah. I managed to sneak into that. When you come into the Rosenbach and you come
Don't think I didn't notice that. Don't think I didn't notice that.
I had no idea.
I love that, and I wish I'd said on the commentary, "In the mirror he makes no reflect," because there you were.
I know. I was in the mirror of the door as you closed the door and walked in, and I didn't notice that. And one of the people at work noticed that, and that was funny that happened. So I'm not a vampire, at least. So we know that.
That's
casting a reflection. You also need to deal with, and if people have questions, put them in. There's a couple more in there that we'll get to, but please add your questions to the Q&A if you have questions for Mark. You have to, in the making of this, just as Bram Stoker did in his notes, deal with what are the rules of vampires, because that has to change no matter who is adapting this or creating any kind of vampire story. And we know Stoker had a list of rules that some he used and some tantalizing ones he didn't. And how did you approach that in making your vampire rules?
Well, we did look at Stoker's rules, as it were, and also the other rules from all the different versions. But I remember one thing that struck me very particularly as a kid was it bothered me in a slightly nerdy way. That's obviously, I know I'm amongst friends, so that's all right. But it bothered me in a nerdy way that vampires were both all powerful and intensely vulnerable. You know, they could do almost anything: turn into animals, turn into mist, you know, influence the weather, all these things, and then also be killed by virtually anything. You know, yogurt, drafts, potatoes. It seemed to be, the list was endless. So it was like, we've got to work out what our version is, just to make it dramatically interesting. It can't do everything. It doesn't turn into a bat or a wolf or anything like that. It can't turn into mist because he can just go under doors and stuff like that. Sunlight, obviously, you feel like you have to do, even though, of course, as we know in the book, he walks around in daylight. It's much more of a thing from the films. But the thing was, it was really interesting, and I think this is a good note for adaptation of any classic, is trying to reframe familiar questions. So there are lots of things we take for granted about vampires. They don't cast a reflection, they can't go out in sunlight, they can't come in uninvited. And Steve and I were literally interrogating these ideas, and suddenly it was like, what if weirdly, and amongst all this lore and superstition, that one is really right? In a way, the most illogical. Why can't he come into a room without being invited? It seems like the most romantic thing in the world. And then if you sort of put a question mark at the end of it, you've suddenly got a totally new way of looking at it. Mm-hmm. And that was the beginning of that whole journey into what is his secret? You know, what's it about? And I think that's a very valid way of looking at anything, you know, anything that's been done a lot, or anything that we feel like we know backwards. Now, what's the point in doing this again? You can slightly reframe the question, and it becomes interesting again, you know. And in fact, even like in episode 3, when it's like the character in the house that he's menacing, Chantal played, she knows a few things, and she says, can you not look in a mirror? And he says, do I look like the sort of person who can't look in a mirror? And in fact, there is a reason, again, he doesn't like looking in a mirror because of his shame, and etc.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes you can make a joke out of it. Sometimes it's an actual sort of a new way of looking at it, I think.
I love the way you approach the mirror and the reflection in that. It's very Dorian Gray kind of answer to what he sees in the mirror, isn't it?
Yes, what he sees is very different. He knows what's really there, I suppose.
But a mirror is a kind of true reflection for him, at least. Yeah. Bruce in the chat and the questions asks, could you tell us more about Dolly Wells, who was outstanding? He wrote impressive, outstanding, I'm saying, as Sister Agatha and Zoe Helsing.
Well, Dolly came in. We saw a lot of wonderful women for Agatha, and it was a very interesting thing. What we were trying to get, I suppose, is in a way, you know, it was a co-lead. We wanted to do something different with Van Helsing, and what she just came in, and she was just immediately brilliant. She's part Dutch, so she knew the accent, and also she had this sort of off-kilter smile. She just didn't look like anyone else I'd seen, you know, any of us had seen. It was just like, who's that? That's amazing. And just the way she did it. And she also had this brilliant thing, which she continued all the way through, of a kind of slightly dangerous excitement about it, which you can imagine. I mean, she gets all those nuns killed. She's a terrible person. But a bit like the way the first Doctor Who, William Hartnell, is a slightly more edgy and disruptive figure. He deliberately sabotages his TARDIS so he can explore. He's more selfish, and there's something about that about Dolly's Van Helsing. She's sort of, you know, when Dracula arrives at the convent, she looks through the broken window and says, "Oh, how exciting!" Because it's suddenly she knows about the dark side and is therefore very drawn to it, very interested in it. So no one else embodied it like she did. She just had this kind of glee to her, which is just brilliant.
Well, Van Helsing's like that in the novel too, and Seward
Yeah.
especially, where they kind of egg on the circumstances
Mm.
in order to understand them first, and then combat them. And
Yes, yes. It's a bit like Rasputin's edict, isn't it? You have to sin to be forgiven. They sort of wade deep into evil in order to combat it.
here's a very bookish kind of question, because in Stoker, because you saw the notes in crafting his novel, he comes up with a way of, like, he has like a 5-act way of doing it at first. It's like Transylvania to London, and what are the others? Transylvania to London, tragedy, discovery, punishment. He's got this 4-part structure at first, and then he changes it to 3, but he's thinking in terms of either a stage play or a novel. Did adapting it, is it how much did knowing that you were crafting 3 distinct episodes for TV play into how you structure the story in adapting it?
Well, in a way, it's kind of, it might not immediately be apparent, but it's actually, it follows the beats of the book. Essentially, we made a film out of the first third, as it were, the Castle Dracula stuff, really. Then massively expanded the 8 pages of the Demeter, and then the Lucy. Then the part 3 is mostly the Lucy story, Lucy and her 3 suitors. So it's all there in a way. It wasn't. So in a way, that was an interesting thing to as opposed to a series where you're thinking, right, Sherlock Holmes has adventures, he has cases, and we looked at it as a 3-part adaptation, a loose adaptation, but it was very much that. It was because, interestingly, early on we talked about we were going to, yes, the original plan was we were going to do a very tight 90-minute version of the book as episode 1. The second episode was going to be set somewhere possibly like the 70s, and the third one would be modern day. And then I remember Stephen saying, the thing is, we didn't do that with Doyle, with Conan Doyle. You didn't use up Doyle. And I think there's a danger that we would, if we got to the end of episode 1 and there was no more Stoker, it would feel slightly like it's slightly illegitimate, and I think it's a very, very valid point, because there's so much stuff, there's so much rich stuff there, isn't there, which is not done or rarely done, or interesting little fragments of stuff. I found, looking at the papers, it was too much to put in, of course, but just those amazing little things about no artist being able to capture his likeness, and there's a bit, he can change size as well, and that that ending where Quincy brings him down with a Gatling gun.
Yeah,
I'd love to see that.
Yeah, the cast exposed, right? Well, that whole Michael Bay ending to the novel.
Yes,
originally envisaged. So, TP Toothpickings has a question here. Did you ever consider making your Dracula less regal and magnetic, perhaps gruffer and unattractive? And it makes me think of how when James Bond wanted to reboot and they wanted Daniel Craig and they wanted a rougher, kind of character for him. Did you ever consider that for Dracula?
Not really. I mean, it's not. I mean, you in a way you get the hit of that by making him basically a nasty old man at the beginning. But I think everyone is waiting for him to get young again, and because we know what we want. I think also this is an interesting point. It goes for Bond as much as anything else, but everything is cyclical. We haven't. There was a point where Gothic was out, and everything had to be much more. Maybe much more believable, gritty, and then the wheel turns. I always use the analogy of spaceships. Spaceships used to be like Kubrick spaceships, and then Alien came, and everyone brilliantly bought into the idea that spaceships would have pin-ups and slinkies, and blue tack on the walls, and they were filthy, and of course they would be. I mean, look at any merchant ship, you know, that's what. But weirdly, the wheel has turned, and now spaceships, especially in Star Trek, look brand new all the time again, you know, and white ships, white starships, and everything are back in. And I think the same is true of the kind of Gothic cycle. You know, you suddenly go, actually, I'd like a Dracula who is tall, dark, handsome, in a scarlet lined cloak again, because it feels like it's time. Incidentally, that's what I feel about James Bond, is that after scoring such a massive hit with Daniel Craig's version, it now feels like the world, I think, needs a bit more Roger Moore again, because it's so dark. On a bit more levity, and who that is, I don't know, but I think it feels like we need someone to walk out of the shadows who looks more like Connery again.
Well, I was supposed to take a mid-break, and I was going to throw a couple things in. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a little moment to just a station break to talk about a couple Rosenbach programs, and then we can just finish with you talking is what I'm going to do now. And I wanted to tell everybody that we have a show called Sundays with Dracula. If you're new to watching this today, we have a show called Sundays with Dracula that airs every Sunday live at 2 p.m. U.S. East Coast time. On the show, we illuminate, unravel, disentangle Bram Stoker's novel about bloodsuckers in the 1890s, one chapter at a time for 27 weeks. Co-hosts join me each week to create a kind of conversational annotation of the entire novel. We actually began on May 3rd when the novel begins, and will end on November 8th, just a couple days after the novel ends. So it's 27 chapters in 27 weeks. And we have special guests on some of the episodes. We've had Dacre Stoker on. We've had Leslie Klinger, Gwendolyn Keiss, Grady Hendrix. Tomorrow's show on Sundays with Dracula will be Anno Dracula author Kim Newman, a neighbor of yours, Mark, right? He'll be here to help us break down chapter 21 of Dracula. And the last show on November 8th, which will be chapter 27, and it's also Bram Stoker's birthday on November 8th, Sir Christopher Frayling is going to join us to talk about the last chapter of the novel. So
Royalty.
Yes, and we have like in America too. It's like I tell everybody, we have a knight on the show.
I know, he's Gothic royalty, Chris Frayling.
Sundays with Dracula is free to watch, and all the past episodes are posted on the Rosenbach website, Facebook, and YouTube. And we can present Sundays with Dracula for free because of the outstanding support we receive from our audience. We are resurrecting a special offer right now called the Dracula Club, in which you can get a full 1-year membership to the Rosenbach for $30. It's $25 off the regular membership price. And members of the Dracula Club get free access to our Monday Drac Chat program, which we also do, 10% off all reading courses that we run, and 50% off of any Rosenbach programs like this one today. Some of you are already in the Dracula Club and you got 50% off this today. We also have Dacre Stoker is coming to do his presentation called Stoker on October 7th. We have 2 virtual behind the bookcase programs called Dracula, the Enduring Monster, in which myself and Elizabeth Fuller, you know, Mark, the librarian at the Rosenbach, get to do we pull out the notes and we'll share them, Stoker's notes, and we'll share them with you and really talk about how he shaped the novel. But most of all, by joining the Dracula Club, you get the undying satisfaction of helping support the home of Stoker's notes for Dracula. So back to Mark. What was
Rosenbach it? It's a wonderful place. I wish I could have spent days there. It was just amazing.
Thank you. Well, you're welcome back anytime. And
one of these days, if we ever travel again.
If you're in the U.S. and if you're near Philly, you should come by. Yeah. Boy, I showed you the Conan Doyle manuscript for Sherlock's Empty House.
The one I put in my bag. What you've got now is my photocopy of it.
All righty. So you're welcome back anytime. What I wanted to ask you too is, what was it like play one of the iconic characters of the novel? You get to play Renfield in your great adaptation. What was that like doing Renfield? And of course you have to know, like, Dwight Fry is in your head and all of this stuff. What was it like playing Renfield?
Well, wonderful. I mean, it was. I played Renfield on stage 25 years ago, and I obviously it's a wonderful part, and I particularly fond of Dwight Fry, obviously, and Jack Shepherd again in the Louis Jourdain version. He's brilliant, properly disturbing, I think. And so our Renfield, what we did was we did what the play does, what the Lugosi film does, which was essentially conflate Harker and Renfield, so that Harker becomes a fly eater, and we sort of thought that was going to be it, and then by the time we got to episode 3, we'd come up with this idea that of Dracula having a lawyer, because he would in this day and age. there would be a way out for him, you know, and it seemed logical that it was his original legal representative. You know, they've been representing him since 1897, and so yeah, that's how it came about. And I mean, we didn't do any of obviously the asylum stuff, and but there's a little bit of fly eating, but it was a nice thing to chart, and I find that whole relationship fascinating. I suppose it's like, in a way, it sort of wrote the book for a lot of those kind of villain henchman relationships, something sort of slightly cruel and master servant about it, which is very interesting, and there's a very long shadow that the Dracula Renfield relationship casts, and whether that is Irving and Stoker, which we shall debate till the end of time, but I think probably it was, as he seemed to own him body and soul, didn't he?
There's so many it's so hard to figure out how Renfield gets in, like there's some in the novel that there's some psychic connection. How are they involved? And that's but adaptations can really answer these kinds of questions. And for you, it's, you know, he's his lawyer in this version, which I should also say Elizabeth Fuller also asked that question. You know, our librarian asked that question too.
No, it was a joy to do, and I mean, again, you know, just allowing a little bit of Thorley Walters into it by letting my cuffs drag in the dirt, like Ludwig in Dracula Prince of Darkness. A little nod there.
That was great. I love that. Towards the end there, we have that going on. I mean, because you really show Renfield's kind of, you know, degeneracy over time.
Yeah, so. He lives in his car. He ends up living in his car and basically begging to be killed, you know, just because he just obeys him completely. Yeah.
A couple quick questions from people not related to Dracula, but I'd love to ask them too, because Niels, who is from over in Denmark, he watches Sundays with Dracula. He has a question. He says, "Do you plan to be involved in more ghost stories for Christmas? Are we getting any M.R. James in the future?"
Well, yes, I hope so. I'm afraid to say, and I'm very sad, nobody knows this yet, but we're going to do one for this Christmas, and there were various shenanigans because, you know, we haven't got very much money to do it, and then the COVID regulations are just put so much more money onto doing it because everything is slowed down, temperature checks, costume cleaning, everything's so much more difficult. But we managed to get the extra money to do it, but we can't do it because of insurance. So I'm hoping that we can shoot it the beginning of next year for next Christmas, but I'm sad to say there won't be one this Christmas. I mean, hopefully there'll be.
You know, you have fans, myself included, that want to see more M.R. James. You know,
God, yes.
You know, so yeah,
nothing gives me greater pleasure. I'll do them for the rest of time if I'm allowed to. But it's been very sad because we really worked hard and got everything together, but it's just circumstance. I mean, you know, the only things that are getting made are either things that were already shooting before lockdown, or things that where the insurance is provided by the distributor or the film company and stuff like that. So, and of course, and everything might shut down again in 5 minutes anyway. So, fingers crossed, there'll be another one for next year.
Les Klinger asks, "Any chance of you ever doing a Frankenstein?"
I shouldn't think so. This is heretical, isn't it? But I think Frankenstein is an important book, but it's a very difficult read. I think Dracula is a much more fun book, and I think
Definitely
that's
is
one of
that,
the,
yeah.
I think that's one of the reasons it's been so popular. It really is. It's particularly, as I said, particularly I think the first third is so exciting, and it properly, it's what you want from a pulpy book. That's what it is, a wonderful pulpy classic. Frankenstein obviously is very important and has led to some amazing adaptations, but I don't know, maybe it goes back to the love of vampires from childhood. I was never as fond of the monster as the Count, and I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because children
and
usually
I
find
don't.
it. Children
It's
usually
not working our way through a list. Not working our way through a list. It may seem that way, but I don't know. Who knows?
Here's a question I have for you, just because of I know your love of and involvement in Doctor Who. If you could have any of the doctors from all time, from Hartnell on, play Dracula, who would you have liked to see play Dracula?
That's a very interesting question. I think. Well, I know Peter Capaldi. Well, Peter Capaldi is a huge horror fan, particularly Hammer. In fact, as his leaving present when he left Doctor Who, I bought him the album of Dracula AD 1972, which is his favorite. He'd have been a brilliant Dracula. But then, interestingly, you know, if you were going younger, I think Matt Smith would have been a very interesting Dracula. I mean, who knows? That you know, at different stages, all kinds of different things. I mean, it's the qualities you have to be a doctor are the leading man qualities you need to play a part like Dracula. So, I mean, some of them are more obvious fits than others, but I'm sure there would have been some very interesting, very interesting takes there.
Final question.
Oh,
we're at that time. What do you think is the secret of Dracula's power that we're still reading, talking about, and filming it over 100 years later? What is it about this book for you that really holds true for today's audience as well?
I think it's two things. It is obviously the book, which contains it's such a good yarn. You know, largely it's a very, very clever book. And what Stoker did brilliantly was distill all kinds of legends into this sort of figure. He's like Dracula's a sort of decanter, you know. He just got it right. You know, the name is so brilliant. I mean, whether we accept this as true or not, but you can, even if that little annotation in the guidebook is his or not, the moment his eyes fell upon that name with its wonderful cadence, he must have thought, "Oh, that's good." And that's just one of those magical things. If you hadn't found that, it might have been, you know, Count Vampire, all those things
here.
slightly, we quite shudder about. But it's a sort of distillation of all these brilliant ideas and legends. And then, as I say, it's also this weird public decision. It's a sort of committee decision arrived at through decades and decades of different adaptations, where we think this is what Dracula has to be. So it's not just the novel, it's a lot of the brilliant stuff that's come after it, which has sort of become part of the same immortal undead.
Well done. Thank you. Dracuphiles out there, thank you for tuning in today. We also have a Sundays with Dracula Facebook group where we continue the conversation. If you look us up on Facebook and join in, I'm sure today's chat for the rest of today and tomorrow will all about you, Mark. And everyone, I ask you to join me tomorrow for Sundays with Dracula and our very special guest, Kim Newman. I am super stoked about that. If you're looking for more virtual engagement, head on over to the Rosenbach website and check out other virtual offerings that we have. Mark, my gosh, I thank you so much for taking the time today.
My absolute pleasure. I've now got to go and watch Canada's Drag Race, so forgive me.
That is great.
Thank you very much,
everyone. We will be played out by Tucker Christine's Pleated Gazelle song, Storm into Whitby, the theme for our Sundays with Dracula. In the words of our friend Dracula, go safely and leave something of the happiness you bring. Bye-bye, Mark. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ed. That was great.
Thanks, Mark.
Bye.